Hi there, thank you for joining me for this ASHA CEU presentation on auditory processing advancements. My name is Dr. Matthew Barker. I am founder and director of Acoustic Pioneer. As founder and director of Acoustic Pioneer, I do have a financial disclosure to make. I do not have a non-financial disclosure to make, but this course content, although that will focus primarily on the Acoustic Pioneer programs, it will also include information on other available therapies and testing. Anytime I listen to somebody give a speech or give me information about something, I always prefer to have a little bit of background on that person. So I wanted to take a couple minutes just to give you a little bit of my background and the story that got me to being involved in auditory processing. I was born in a little place called Texas, and after graduating high school, I went to college at Southwest Texas, which is now called, if you Google Southwest Texas, not there. It was at the time and is now called Texas State. I was a delivery driver for the university, and so I delivered to a whole bunch of different programs, and the speech pathology program and audiology program had, in my opinion, the coolest people, so it really interested me in the field. I then applied and was accepted to Texas Tech University program for communication disorders, graduated there, and moved on to get my AUD at the Health Sciences Center at Texas Tech. During my doctoral research project, I focused primarily on auditory processing testing and how they were developed and how they compared to each other. And from then, upon graduation, moved to a little country in the South Pacific known as New Zealand. And I stayed there for about 12 years, all up. And at the time, I worked sort of two jobs while I was there for a bit. One for a private hearing aid company called Bay Audiology, and the other for the University of Canterbury down in Christchurch, teaching psychoacoustics and auditory processing disorders. And during my tenure there, I started the first development project I'd ever done, which, as far as I know, was the world's first do-it-yourself touchscreen hearing test, or air conduction hearing screening, I guess you could say. It was a threshold searching program. One of the issues in private practice is finding quality leads, and I worked with Bay Audiology to do this project, and they're still using it today. I mean, we've updated it. This is the original. We've updated it to an iPad version. This was developed before the iPad existed, actually, so it was using other technology. Anyway, so that's where my development interest peaked. After this project sort of concluded, I was minding my own business, driving down the road, drinking a fantastic New Zealand coffee, when God put another idea in my head. He said, "Matt, why don't you try to make auditory processing fun?" So I listen when the big man speaks, and I started a little company called Acoustic Pioneer. And since that time, this was in 2009, it's been, almost a decade, not quite. We have done a lot of development, a lot of research, a lot of publications, and we continue to do so as we go. Now, currently, I've moved back stateside. I still do a lot for Acoustic Pioneer. I also consult for a hearing aid company, G and Resound. And because I don't like to be bored, I also lecture at the Texas Tech University Health Science Center, psychoacoustics and advanced amplification. Now, as an outline on this recording, the first half of the recording is going to be a review of what auditory processing is. It's not going to focus so much on the Acoustic Pioneer programs, but it's going to focus on the literature and what the profession, the opinions of the professionals that have been doing this for a while, and how things relate to higher level tasks like language, reading, memory, attention, and although it's not listed, IQ as well. In the second half, we are going to talk about the data behind an auditory processing test from Acoustic Pioneer. We are going to also review some targeted therapies, some from Acoustic Pioneer, some that were the brainchild of Dr. Terry Bellis, and get to, hopefully if there's time, some case examples. Now, this is a nice basic question. What is auditory processing? And lucky for us, in the next slide, we are going to review a publication from ASHA, published in 2014, that is specifically addressing this question. So let's look at that. This publication by ASHA just a few years ago is meant to differentiate or help us differentiate between APD, speech and language disorders, and reading disorders. It's a little bit lengthy, but I think it's worth going through, and you'll note I'm going to emphasize a few key words or phrases here. Auditory processing disorders are deficits in the information processing of audible signals not attributed to impaired peripheral hearing sensitivity, meaning hearing loss, or intellectual impairment. This information processing involves perceptual, cognitive, and linguistic functions that, with appropriate interaction, result in effective receptive communication of auditorily presented stimuli. Specifically, APD refers to limitations on the ongoing transmission, analysis, organization, transformation, elaboration, storage, retrieval, and use of information contained in audible signals. APD may involve the listener's active and passive, conscious, unconscious, mediated, unmediated, controlled, and automatic ability to do the following: attend, discriminate, and identify acoustic signals, transform and continuously transmit information through both the peripheral and central nervous systems, filter, sort, and combine information at appropriate perceptual and conceptual levels, store and retrieve information efficiently, restore, organize, and use retrieved information, segment and decode acoustic stimuli using phonological, semantic, syntactic, and pragmatic knowledge, and attach meaning to a stream of acoustic signals through the use of linguistic and non-linguistic context. Okay, I hope that cleared things up. Now, I don't know why, but reading that definition made me think of a quote I'd heard somewhere before. Now, I don't mean to give them a hard time, and I'm going to get into why the definition is really hard. So we'll get into it. So I agree with that definition. Just anyway, let me drill down on that in just a little bit. Now, here's their definition of a language disorder. A language disorder is impaired comprehension, use of spoken, written, or other symbol systems. The disorder may involve the form of language, phonology, morphology, syntax, the content of language, semantics, or the function of language, pragmatics. Now, did you guys notice some overlap in those two definitions? Now, that definition of auditory processing, like I said, I actually agree with, but I think it's a really complicated and detailed definition. A definition that has been used by others, especially to explain what auditory processing is to somebody like parents or perhaps teachers, was formulated by an actual pioneer, a fantastic man, Dr. Jack Katz. He says that auditory processing is what the brain does with what the ears hear. Now, similar to the ASHA definition, I don't think this is quite specific enough. What the brain does with what the ears hear. Now, you're hearing me right now, but you're processing what I'm saying in your Wernicke's area, in your language center. You're understanding my language that I'm speaking. So I'm going to offer a new definition. I'm going to say it's pre-receptive language processing. It's what happens before receptive language. We know with many studies that we process receptive language in Wernicke's area, which is just past the primary auditory cortex. But a lot happens between when the ear picks up the sound of language and sends those signals rostrally upward toward the primary auditory cortex or Wernicke's area. So it's the things that happen before we get to Wernicke's that is the auditory processing realm. So it's your pre-receptive language processing. That means that auditory processing is under the larger umbrella of receptive language. All right, quick pop quiz for you. I know you can't answer because it's a recording, but what is another common educational skill that falls under the receptive language umbrella? And you probably know this already, but many people don't. And here's a quick clue. It uses these sensory end organs, not the ear, but the eye. And it falls under the receptive language umbrella. I'll give you another clue. That's right, I'm sure you've got it by now. The answer is reading. And a lot of people really get confused when I say reading is an auditory skill. So, what? Reading is auditory? All right, I'm just going to, there's no audio to this slide, other than my voice. Just going to say that. See if you tell me if you hear something. Right? And I can't let Sheldon go unanswered, so now I hear these in their voices, which is often the case if you know somebody very well and they've written you a letter or sent you an email or a text. You can often read it in their actual voice, not just auditorily. So yeah, their reading is auditory. This is just a nice sort of example of that. Now, a lot of studies have been done on how the brain processes reading. And we know from functional MRIs and other electrophysiological studies that the first part of the brain that lights up when somebody begins to read, especially novel stimuli, is the visual cortex. Of course, your eyes have to look at those graphemes or letters and figure out what they're meant to be saying or what sound they're meant to be producing. But once you look at the grapheme, the next area to light up, surprise, surprise, is the primary auditory cortex. And those take, especially with novel stimuli, it takes those graphemes, attaches a sound to each of them and puts it in the correct order. And once those sounds are in the correct order, it moves it down to Wernicke's for processing of the language or the speech signal. Now, a more historic version of auditory processing definition from ASHA and AAA, which I find a bit more enlightening. It's a bit more detailed. It says auditory processing is defined as the stuff in the brain that is used to do these things: sound localization, lateralization, auditory diagram, pattern recognition, temporal aspects, performance in competing signals, and performance with degraded signals. Now we're going to drill down into each of these individually. If you are an audiologist that does this on a routine basis, this is going to be a big review, but you might glean a few snippets of new information from time to time. Now, before we drill down into each of those areas that use auditory processing that aren't using language, I want to address something else. Sometimes when I go and give a presentation someplace, somebody will come up to me and ask, I've seen an article that sort of got a lot of attention and buzz that sort of made the claim that auditory processing didn't really exist. It was just a manifestation of either IQ or memory and or attention. And although, yes, there are articles that have been published that don't allocate for these variables, just in my own personal library, I can pull up a few that investigate the impacts of auditory processing and do account for IQ, memory, and or attention. And you can see it's not just a few. So no, the findings state that the surprise, surprise, the ear and the pathway from the ear to the primary auditory cortex is actually important. Okay, so back to the ASHA and AAA defined definitions. We're going to go through each of these individually. First is sound localization and lateralization. Now these are kind of two aspects of the same skill. Sound localization is done in a three-dimensional field. That's what we do in everyday life. Lateralization is done either through headphones or bone conduction, and the listener is trying to determine if the sound is coming from the left ear, from the right ear, or some pathway on that continuum between the left and right ear. It can come from the middle of the head, but that's in the under the headphones or bone conduction stimuli only. And for normal everyday environments, we don't hear in a two-dimensional realm. We hear in a three-dimensional realm. Therefore, we locate sound left, right, up, down. Okay, so the processing of the localization and lateralization signals occurs in the superior olivary complex, which is in the lower brainstem, but the perception occurs cortically. Now, the superior olive is the first nucleus or point in that rostral pathway or upward pathway from the ear that receives information from both ears. Lateralizing and localizing requires the brain to compare information from both ears. Auditory discrimination, from a non-trained observer, might think this means how clearly you can hear, and that's not what we're testing. It's can you discriminate that two signals are not the same? In sound, there are really only two aspects. There's frequency and there's intensity. So the most often tested discrimination is how close in frequency can we put two tones and you still tell that they're different? Or for the intensity, how loud or close in loudness can we put two tones and you still say, no, that one is louder and that one is softer? That's the difference Lyman. Now, the frequency and intensity difference Lymans do require a cortical aspect, but a lot of the information is gathered literally when it leaves the inner hair cell. When it leaves the cochlea and gets onto that auditory nerve, information regarding the frequency Lyman and not the Lyman, but the information regarding frequency and intensity are gathered first thing on the auditory nerve. Now, it's kind of under this area, but it sort of also falls under the temporal processing, which we'll get to in a second, is some really exciting frontier work about not can you tell the difference between frequency or intensity, but can you tell the changes of signals over time? Can you differentiate between how they're changing? Can you say that one changes faster than this one, or that one changes slower than this one? This is sort of something to really focus on and keep your eye on, because this is probably where the field is going next. Auditory pattern recognition is a bit of a broad term. It doesn't have a really great specific definition. It's sort of a catch-all phrase for many things. For example, here's an auditory pattern recognition that you would do all the time. Turn the radio on, hear a song start playing, you recognize that song. You're recognizing the auditory pattern of sound. That a song is just a bunch of auditory patterns put together. So is something like a doorbell. That's a ding dong. You recognize that auditory pattern. Speech is an auditory pattern. Speech is something that is different across the globe because the people that lived in that particular area agreed that this pattern of sound, for example, car, k, ah, meant a motor vehicle, right? It's a sociological or socially agreed pattern that, hey, that means this. This pattern of sound means that thing. Your cell phone ring, that's another pattern recognition. So auditory pattern recognition is important, but it's not just specific to any particular stimuli. All right, a quick pop quiz. What non-linguistic auditory sound stimuli relates to language? I know it's a bit of a trick question. What is not language? that is language? Let me give you a hint. I'm betting that somebody or you have already guessed that Morse code. So Morse code is simply a pattern of sounds that is not language, right? These are just tones, either in a short or long duration. Whatever the pattern they come in directly relates to a letter. For example, the short, the beginning, that is the letter I. I won't go through all of them, but this says to somebody that knows Morse code, I am reading. So this is not language to us, but to somebody who is trained in this is language. So it's a non-typical language, but it is. Okay, all right, I'll move on. Moving on to temporal aspects of audition. Now this has sort of several subcategories that we'll get into. First is temporal integration. Now, we don't hear in instantaneous units. Our brain integrates sound over time. Now, when somebody says temporal integration, most of the time we're talking about can you hear the sound or not. So it's a threshold test. If I find somebody's auditory threshold, let's say it's at 10 dB, 1000 hertz, if I start making that sound shorter, especially below 200 milliseconds, the shorter it goes, let's say down to 100 milliseconds, I might have to turn it up to 13 dB or 15 dB before the individual can hear it again. So if I drop it down to 50 milliseconds, I'm going to have to turn the signal up louder. So we integrate information over time, and it's usually in sort of short time spurts, but think of it like an auditory window that sort of keeps the information that has gone through over a time window, and it sends that information up to the brain. Temporal discrimination, also known as temporal resolution, is typically, sometimes people call it gap detection or frequency modulation detection, is trying to kind of determine how quickly the ear can hear changes in the auditory spectrum. Temporal ordering is not so much how quickly can we hear, but can we take sounds that come to us and follow the pattern that they were delivered. Often this is tested by sending a set of pitch patterns or a set of duration patterns. So duration patterns, the Morse code that we just played, that's a perfect example of duration patterns. The tone is the exact same frequency. It is either in a short or long presentation. And the pattern that it is delivered is the temporal ordering task. So we can do the same thing with pitch. For example, we would expect the listener to know that that's a high, high, low pattern. Temporal masking. Masking of a signal means that you're taking typically a noise and covering up typically a tone. You can mask tones and tones, you can mask speech with speech, you can do all other kinds of masking, but generally the masker is trying to cover up the signal. Now, temporal masking adds an extra facet to that test, and it puts the masker before and then the tone. So the masker happens, turns off, and then a tone happens. Beep. Or backward masking is the reverse of that. First the tone, then the masker. And if we play them close enough in time and the tone still isn't heard, that's a temporal masking, meaning it's not based on the power per se, but the timing of the ear. Even though the tone was presented when there was no masking played, the listener still didn't hear that sound. Now, going back to temporal integration, as I said, this happens sort of over a short window of time. We think this happens predominantly in the cochlea, or very beginning of the auditory nerve. The temporal resolution or gap detection, we know that there's definitely a cochlear aspect, but there's likely some sort of upper brainstem or midbrain areas involved, and even cortical on both sides. The predominant information for can we do the temporal resolution kind of indicates it does not involve the corpus callosum, so the interhemispheric area, but the information that's available to date kind of indicates the predominant area that we're testing is that primary auditory cortex for that decision of was there a gap or was there not a gap in between two signals. Temporal ordering, we've reviewed about the pitch patterns or the duration patterns. We think that the decision device is using the primary auditory cortex on the right hemisphere. However, if we have the patient label the device or label that pattern, then we have to send the signal over to the left hemisphere because Broca's is on the left side typically, and that involves the transmission of information through the corpus callosum. All right, let's drill down a little bit more into that temporal masking. First, I want to review backward masking. Remember, this is the phenomenon where there's a signal and a masker, but they don't happen at the same time, yet we can't hear the signal. Backward masking can be completely trained out, and that pretty much means it's not a real thing. If you can train something out, it's not a physiological phenomena. Forward masking, on the other hand, meaning the masker happens first and then the signal, can't be trained out. The reverse, the signal happens first, then the masker, is more of a test of, hey, this is a really weird task. I don't know what I'm listening for, but once the listener knows what they're after, they can totally hear that tone or signal, even if it's abutted immediately against the masking signal, meaning no gap. Okay, now forward masking has sort of three areas that we feel are contributing to it. Now, the first, basal membrane ringing, meaning in the cochlea, when a sound occurs, the sound comes through, the basal membrane starts moving. And just like anything that's moving, for example, picture a child on a swing, you push the child, they start moving. You keep pushing them, they keep moving. If you stop pushing them, they do not halt immediately, right? They continue to move until inertia, or with the inertia until they finally come to a halt. The basal membrane does the same thing. So the sound starts coming in, that basal membrane starts to move, the sound ceases, the basal membrane continues to move for a short duration at whatever frequency the sound was until it comes to a halt. But if you play a sound at this while it's still ringing, the cochlea won't know a new sound is occurring, and it won't hear it. Now, there's other evidence that when the neural system is active from a sound, it originally or initially has a big response, and then it sort of fades off very quickly, and it slowly plateaus and fades off as it suppresses that information. So if you turn that masker signal off and turn the tone signal on close enough, that central suppression might still be in its suppressed state and not ready to do the large activation again. The other signal that I think could contribute significantly is what we call our efferent activation. Now, most people think the ear as a sensory organ, and it is, but it's also a motor organ. So it's a sensory motor system. We have pathways from the brain, even as high as the cortex, that go down to the cochlea directly and tell it to do things. Typically, well, it's always a suppression task, meaning the brain can tell the ear, don't amplify that signal as much, or don't send as much information through the auditory nerve up to the brain. So we can actually tell our ear to suppress its sensitivity. So that's huge in the auditory processing domain. So the efferent activation, if the brain's telling the ear, hey, calm down, and we turn the masker off and a tone too close in time, that efferent activation might still be occurring. In my opinion, the most impactive variable that we've reviewed is going to be in the cochlea. It's that basomembrane ringing. It's sort of irrefutable that that's a component. The other two could be involved, but again, this is just my opinion. Okay. And written. And now touching on auditory performance and competing signals, which also includes dichotic listening. We will touch on dichotic listening a bit later. The first type of auditory performance and competing signals that people think of is speech and noise, which is probably the most commonly thought of auditory processing test. It is often tested, so I want to review it. When we talk about hearing speech and noise, there's two types of covering up that noise. There's power masking, which is literally the masker has more level or more intensity at those frequencies of the speech signal, or there's informational masking. When we are listening, and I'm going to bring this out even broader, when we are doing anything, we're attending to things visually, cognitively, auditorily, olfactorily, anything, we can only ever attend to one thing at a time. Now, we can shift our attention very quickly, but we can only attend to one thing at a time. Now, in informational masking, if there's two signals being presented, or multiple signals, if we get the listener to following the wrong signal or the wrong information, so they're listening to the wrong thing, they're not attending to the signal. So that is informationally masked. So I've got a demonstration for power masking here.
Bees buzz, bobcat scream, cats meow, cats purr.
Now you would have noticed that the speech at the beginning was easier to understand than speech later because the masker got more power as it went through. Now let me give you an example of informational masking. And I apologize, the sound quality is not amazing, but you'll get the point. Oh, in a live audience, I usually say, look, if you've not heard the song before, I'll give you $1,000 if you can write down all the lyrics. Every single lyric is repeated at least 3 times. There's only 3 lyrics or sets of lyrics. So you write them down by the end of the song, and they're all audible. So anyway, here we go. Again, apology for the sound quality. The way this recording happens, it's a bit limited. Here we go.
Silver butterfly with big old cherry eyes landed on the planet where no one ever cries. An orangey papaya is all that I do see. Your kisses are much sweeter, your lips they set me free. Silver butterfly with big old cherry eyes landed on the planet where no one ever cries. An orangey papaya is all that I do see. Your kisses are much sweeter, your lips they set me free. Silver butterfly with big old cherry eyes landed on the planet where no one ever cries. An orangey papaya is all that I do see. Your kisses are much sweeter, your lips they set me free.
All right. Now, that's just the example I use for informational masking. It's kind of like a row your boat sort of thing. Now, I won't do it for time's sake, but in my psychoacoustics class, I sort of do this, and then I do it again, but I have all the lyrics written, And if you know what you're listening for, you can actually follow each stream. That's what we call it in the auditory domain. Each sound source signal, you can follow it much more easily because you know what you're listening for. And then you're like, oh, I can hear all of those tracks clearly. Anyway, informational masking. Okay, the other type of competing signal that was listed is dichotic listening. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this because this is probably one of the most important tests that we have in our auditory processing test battery. Dichotic listening is simply being able to hear signals from both ears that get that message to the brain. So to test for this, we give each ear a different sound. Typically, like in speech, we would give the left ear one sound and at the exact same time the right ear a different sound or signal, and can the brain get the information from both ears? This is trying to determine, can the brain get information from both ears relatively evenly? So here's a visual example. You can see I'll just do that one more time. The left ear gets a 6, right ear gets a 3. Now, the listener needs to say both 6 and 3. Now, you can see I've got some drawings here of arrows. The right ear, because it received a speech signal, the way the auditory system is sort of designed, the right ear sends the vast majority of its information to the left hemisphere, and the left ear sends the majority of its information over to the right hemisphere. So when we're asking the listener to listen to a speech signal or language, that has to get to Wernicke's, right? So the right ear has a direct path. It's a shorter pathway. Now the neurons fire information amazingly quickly. So if in a developed system, the left ear has a nice quick auditory system, it can send that information to Wernicke's. It goes from the left ear to the right hemisphere, then it moves through the corpus callosum, and then ends up in very close succession to the information that the right ear received. However, if that pathway isn't developed well or fully, the left signal will arrive too slow in time, and pretty much the brain will only listen to the information presented in the right ear. And this is sort of a generalization. There's other variables such as directed attention, meaning if you tell the individual, forget the right ear, focus on the left, then they will hear the information from the left ear, but the right ear information will be gone, meaning arrived and out of memory before they can focus on the right ear. So you'll still get a dichotic listening deficit, but it can be affected by attention. All right. Now, another type of test area that is covered in auditory processing is being able to test one's ability to perform when listening to a degraded signal. Typically, we use speech, and it's degraded in some way. This is done in real life all the time. It can be because it's degraded by background noise. It can be because it's degraded because the speaker is not speaking in a very clear fashion, or they're in an echoey room, or all sorts of other ways. The next slide gives it a good example of degraded speech when it's sped up, and it's kind of fun to watch. So let's see what happens.
I read.
Okay. So do I. Yeah.
I read kind of fast, you know? Like, yeah.
Oh, you read? That's your...
I read. That's my talent.
But what do you do for a living?
Oh, I'm a waitress.
Okay.
In Sherman Oaks.
Okay. All right. God, you're so happy, aren't you?
You're so pretty. It's like looking at a mirror.
Yeah.
No, because you're fun. I'm really happy.
Wow. You're fantastic.
I'm sorry,
All right.
I shouldn't touch you.
You're going to read really fast.
Yeah, I need a book or something,
Okay.
though.
I have, oh, there's my book right there. Okay, you can read my book. All right, should I hold this for you? Oh, your mic. Okay, great.
All right.
Okay.
Stepping on a spider has to be the scariest thing in the world. Actually, do you know what would be scarier if after putting on the one shoe, I recklessly put my foot in the other one and discovered that I was teaming with hundreds of spiders. All the babies were in there. A whole, let's see, it's a goose geese, school of fish, what is group of spiders called? Oh, no, I remember a whole circle of spiders. That'd be the scariest thing ever. Unless if you're camping out in the woods, or not even camping, or even in the woods, you're sleeping in your backyard. I don't know, maybe you like the great outdoors, but you just want to come home and get a fight with something. Okay, that doesn't feel bad. It's a game time. It's only to get back to this, you realize what you got, but you have too much pride, even though your dog's got you from inside the picture window with an expression that's a mixture of pity and confusion. So, and this is the scary part, you're in the backyard and you're just about to doze off and start feeling something funny. Now, haha, but it could be weird funny. So you look inside your sleeping bag and there's a snake crawling up. You're like, ah, that just blows this funny thing out of the way. It's not possible to be any scarier than that.
Wow! Thank you, Trisha.
I love you. I love you.
Thank you. I love you too. We're gonna play it down. We're gonna slow it down and play it back. Okay. I recognize it.
Actually, you know what would be scarier if after putting on the one shoe, I recklessly put my foot in the other one and discovered that I was teaming with hundreds of spiders. All the babies were in there. A whole, let's see, it's a goose geese, school of fish. What is a group of spiders called? Oh, no, I remember a whole circle of spiders. That would be the scariest thing ever. Also, you're camping out in the woods or not even camping or even in the woods. You're sleeping in your backyard. I don't know, maybe.
That's actually my book.
All right, now there's other aspects that we can use other than just speeding the signal up to degrade it. We can, we can scientifically filter out frequencies. This can happen naturally if let's say you're skiing, everybody's wearing a big scarf, and somebody says, "Hey, I'm tired of skiing. Let's go to the lodge. Get a hamburger." Like the signal gets degraded because there's not all the speech frequency there, but you can still fill in the gaps. You can still follow that signal. Now we can add reverberation or echo to the signal. We can filter it, we can make it faster, we can do a combination of those three, we can make the pitch, we can do a number of things to degrade the signal, but the test, the general role of this test is the same, is can you follow the signal even though it is degraded? Now, the skills that we've reviewed today, which are most of them, they're not completely independent of each other. For example, when we have the speech and noise task, if I give the listener the ability to localize the position of the speaker or the speech, the person speaking, and the location of the noise or the masking type signal, if the listener can identify where those two things are in space and they're separate in space, they can follow the listener or the speaker speech far easier with that information. So localization plays a role in speech and noise testing or speech and noise ability. Okay, another example that not all auditory processing skills are independent of each other is speech and noise and low redundancy speech. So remember, low redundancy speech is the speech that arrives at the listener in a degraded fashion somehow. Speech and noise arrives at the listener, but the speech wasn't degraded, but it's more a lot of the information of the speech is being blocked by the noise or covered up by the noise. So the listener has to take that signal and fill in the gaps. So for both of these tasks, the listener is using what we call auditory closure, or closing the signal, or taking the information that's missing and filling in the gaps. Another example that auditory processing is not independent of one another, or each process, the corpus callosum, for example, that's the information, that's the part of the auditory system that connects the right and left primary auditory cortices to each other, so the pathway that connects both hemispheres to each other. If it is significantly affected by some lesion or tumor or significant underdevelopment, yes, dichotic listening will be affected, because remember that dichotic listening has to use the corpus callosum to send the information across to the other side. And so will labeling of pitch patterns. Remember, we hear the pitch pattern on the right, but we label it on the left. And even lateralizing of sounds will be affected. Now, lateralization happens typically in the brainstem, but if the corpus callosum is affected, it will be affected as well. All right, now let's move on to something a little fun. I've talked briefly before about auditory closure. I've got it sort of a good example of how we do that in the visual domain. So this is, I guess, called visual closure. Tell me what that is. What object do you see there? It's missing some information. Here, let me add a bit more information. Need some more? Figure out what that is yet? Yep, that is the number 8. Now, the only way you knew to close this item was because you've seen it before. You know what an 8 is. So if I said, unfairly, what is this item? And you said, hey, it's an 8. And I said, no, it's this. You'd be like, that's unfair. I have no idea what that is. So let's draw back now to the auditory realm. If somebody is being exposed to new information, but the information is presented in a compromised way, meaning they have to sort of fill in the gaps of the novel information, that auditory closure ability becomes more difficult. So a student that has auditory closure difficulties anyway, for known things like the number 8 or a known word or a known phrase, if they struggle to follow that in a competing signal, or if the signal is degraded, they're going to do really, really bad with novel information, with new information. So somebody that tests for difficulties with auditory closure, one of the things that you will see recommended, and rightly so, is maybe pre-teach the vocabulary. You don't have to pre-teach the lesson for them, like meaning teach what they're going to learn at school but ahead of time, but go over the concept, maybe a fraction of the concept, or especially the key vocabulary words that are going to be discussed in a nice direct way that they can maybe see the word and then hear it before they get in a classroom with competing noises and the teacher might be facing the wall or what have you. This is another cool visual closure task, and I just put it in here because it's fun and these things can get a bit dull at times. So do you see the cube? If you didn't, you probably will now. And once you see the cube, even though there's actually no cube there, it's sort of negative space, you can't unsee it. That's the funny thing. Okay. All right, speaking of vision, vision and hearing are not isolated events. What I'm trying to say about that is that the brain takes information from both the eyes and the ears and tries to amalgamate that information to get make the most sense of what the information it receives. For example, it's commonly understood that if you're in a really noisy listening environment and you can see the speaker's face, you can understand what they're saying with a much greater degree of accuracy than if their face is not visible. And in the next slide, I've got another a video example of how vision and hearing are linked. All right, now it's time for a review. And using my nice and simple definition from before, auditory processing is using the skills from the ear upward in the brain before we get to Wernicke's area, that pre-linguistic processing. All right, Matt, we understand. That's great. Who cares? Why do we care about this? All right, good question. What if I told you that we could take a baby, an infant, no older than 3 days old, put electrodes on their scalp in a nice, fine, nice, calm way, and we measure their primary auditory cortex response to short speech stimuli. And we could take that information and predict with a 92% accuracy how well they're going to read, meaning are they going to be dyslexic or a poor reader, when they're 8 years later. So this was a longitudinal study done by Malfeas. This is probably the first and maybe the only journal article that, like, while reading, I got to the point I'm like, whoa, like jaw-dropping. So that in and of itself is a good bit of data that says, oh, yeah, it matters. Surprise, surprise. And this isn't the only one to do predictive abilities with reading and or language. So Another one, okay, well, Matt, that's great, but I don't have a $150,000 electrode machine to measure the cortical response. What about these behavioral measures that you were talking about? So let's just take dichotic listening in and of itself as its own task. This test used a test called dichotic digits for its data. And it looked at 8 to 9-year-olds, and it included children identified by the teacher that were performing the of the most concern, the poorest in the educational environment. It was not specified whether it was reading or whether it was just generally, hey, send us the poorest 20%-ish of your class. And those children were tested just with dichotic listening. Over half of them had a dichotic listening issue. Remember, this is not measuring the entire gamut of auditory processing, just one measure. And that measure was significantly impaired in those poor educational performers consistently, meaning they weren't tested once, but they were tested yet again a second time. So the behavioral manifestation of older children, 8 and 9-year-olds, also stay impaired. So they might start with a poorer ability and they sustain that poorer ability. Although I'm not trying to say that the measure from the 3 to 8-year-old and the 8 and 9-year-old are identical, but we believe them to be related. And I'll drill down a little bit on this later. Another reason why we should care about auditory processing. So when currently, or the vast majority of children, we find them performing poorly in school, we find them either being dyslexic, meaning I've got a normal IQ, but I am not learning to read like my peers, or language difficulties. We're trying to rectify that difficulty. So we target, say, the reading, and we train reading more intensely, and we train language or apply language therapy more intensely. Bamio found that the progress that you're going to make in those direct attention therapies or interventions is going to be slower if the bottom-up pathway is not addressed as well or first. And any conclusion of a journal article, I always like it to make sense to me. Well, to me, that makes perfect sense. So if you're targeting something that's higher level, but you've got some processing issues in the lower system, it makes perfect sense for the upper level to not make as much progress if the lower level is not giving it the information as clear and consistent as it should be. So the bottom up is affected. The higher stages are also going to be affected. All right, another pop quiz just to keep you entertained. In the U.S. and in most countries that I've practiced in for, so in the countries that I'm familiar, the auditory processing disorder can only be diagnosed by which profession? Right, correct. I think in the UK, both, actually, now that I say that, I think both SLPs and audiologists can diagnose CPD, but not in Australia or New Zealand or in the US. Anyway, another easy pop quiz for you. Who can diagnose language disorder? Surprise, surprise, SLP. Now, I'm going to go back to that definition that I shared with you from ASHA 2014 at the beginning that was very, very, very detailed, but it sort of seemed to indicate that language was also part of auditory processing, and then it defined language and it used the same terms, and it's like, why is this so confusing? Quick pop quiz again. Can you give a receptive spoken language assessment without using those auditory pathways to Wernicke's? Of course not. Can you also, and on looking at the other side of the aisle, can you do an auditory processing assessment without impacting or using Wernicke's area at all? And the answer is clearly no. Okay, so when an audiologist diagnoses auditory processing. They focus a lot on the mechanics of the ear. So they check out the eardrum movement, the ossicles, make sure the cochlea is responding to sound. They might check if the acoustic reflex is working. They might check that the outer hair cells or the OAEs are present. They might do any number of tests really focusing, is this ear working well? And once we have cleared that, then we say, okay, well, what about the pathways going up to the primary auditory cortex? How are those working? Yep, that's sort of the process an audiologist will go through. Whereas a speech and language pathologist is like a receptive language assessment. They're trying to measure how is this Wernicke's area receiving this language and following the information. So they're also using that bottom-up pathway, which you have to use the ear for, but they're not focusing on that. So you can see that both of the tests, APD and receptive language, both of them use the ear. Both of them use the pathways going up to the auditory cortex, and both of them use Wernicke's. Audiologists, of course, focus on the ear and the pathway up, but still involves Wernicke's, whereas SLP, they're focusing on Wernicke's, but has to use the pathways up, so they're focusing on the sort of upper end of the pathway for the receptive language task. But you see where the issue is? How do you define auditory processing? Well, it's sort of part of the receptive language continuum. Well, it is completely part of the receptive language pathway. The receptive language pathway is part of the auditory processing. Like, you can't do one without the other. I feel kind of like our professions are kind of a little bit... Does this bring to mind a particular proverb that anybody's heard of? Like the elephant, we're looking at the same thing, just sort of different ends. Anyway, so I think this is a nice descriptor of why has auditory processing been so confusing to date. It falls under the umbrella of receptive language. Now, to prove this point, I love this journal article. The first time I read it, I was very confused. And then anyway, so let me tell you the conclusion. Now, this is out of the UK, so SLI is specific language. We would call this here in the US a language disorder, LD. They compared two groups of children. One group diagnosed with specific language impairment, the other diagnosed with auditory processing disorder. And what did they find? They found that despite the two diagnoses, the two groups of children behaved so similarly, they were the same profile, meaning that whether they received an auditory processing disorder or whether they received a speech and language impairment or LD diagnosis depended on which pathway they went. So if somebody looked at a child and said, this child has problems, you should go see an audiologist, APD. Hey, this child has problems, you should go see a speech therapist, speech and language pathologist. Language disorder. So depending on who you saw first was the label that you received. So the referral route was actually the variable of choice, or that caused the different diagnoses. Okay. If this is true, then Matt, you're telling me that a language disorder is so related to auditory processing, they're the same continuum. If that's true, then if you took a group of speech and language disordered children and tested a lot of them, how many would have a significant deficiency in their auditory processing ability? Well, I'm glad you asked. We tested 140 that have a diagnosis of a speech and language disability or disorder. 116 of them. That calculates to 83%. So if you're a speech and language therapist, 83% of your students have an auditory processing deficiency that likely needs improved or therapeutic intervention. Wow. Now, let's look at some other valuable articles that have been published to date and the conclusions that they've come through. One of the most important, like, okay, Matt, this is great. What's the gold standard for testing auditory processing disorder? Like, I get this a lot, and sadly, there is no gold standard. And there's a great article that was recently published by Dr. Remiglio out of East Carolina University. And the issue is auditory processing historically began not for educational or language purposes, but for assisting neurosurgeons to try to locate if and where a lesion occurred. So this is sort of pre-MRI, pre-CAT scan sort of technology. We couldn't take a picture of the brain. We couldn't look at it. So we would try to do these tasks and figure out, okay, well, this person had a lesion in their corpus callosum, and they can't do these things. Oh, well, then we sort of draw the reverse conclusion that that pathway must be involved in that skill to some degree. Now, I won't go into too much detail of the article. Feel free to it's listed here. It's online. Basically, there's a lot of inconsistencies. You get 2 lesions of the corpus callosum. They might be in slightly different parts. They might be different causes. They might be different locations. They might be different sizes. All these variables in that particular lesion. And you can see in this comparison of these 4 studies, not all lesions are the same. Not all target areas are affected. So it's not surprising that then and then also the reference, meaning how do we confirm the lesion was actually there, yes or no. And then you get these major differences, like from 30% to 87.5% sensitivity, or from I don't know how specific it was, to 100% specific. So the lesion studies have a lot of issues to date with them. And this is another example of somebody that has used a particular test, an auditory test, to try to determine is there a lesion or not. And in this one, they use the same target disorder. But again, you don't have the same information about, like, are they all the same size? Are they all in the same exact location? All these, are they all created by the same cause? They use different measures like a CAT scan or self-report or electrophysiological testing, meaning electrodes on the scalp, and you get all these differences in sensitivity, specificity data. So what's the gold standard? Well, this sort of method of using lesions to reference the auditory test has issues. Oh, sorry, just catching up with my movement. Okay. Now, it's been mentioned in the literature that these latter lesion studies are valuable in figuring out what goes wrong, meaning what skills are affected depending on what area of the brain is affected by these lesions. That's good information. But transferring this disordered or damaged brain skill to, like, that of a student, which doesn't have a lesion, they just haven't developed these skills, or that's the reigning thought at the moment anyway. It's just a delayed brain. Transferring information from a disordered to delayed should be used with caution as well. Now, some people have suggested that a better method to get a gold standard would actually be to do sort of a behavioral symptom sort of tally or checklist, like what is this child presenting with difficulties in, do the auditory processing measures, then apply therapy, the TX, that means therapy, and apply the therapy for those directly targeted skills, and clearly have, like, your double blind and control group and stuff like that, and measure the improvement of the direct targeted skill against, so like a post-test with an auditory processing measure, and then look at what behaviors have changed in that child. Now, this would clearly require a longitudinal study, so this would be a big one, but I kind of concur with this approach versus using lesions. Now here's another study that I want to review, which is also another good approach, I think, to sort of finding a gold standard. Now this is a study done by Dr. Deborah Moncrief and group, published 14 years ago, 15 years ago, back in 2004. What they did is they used an electrophysiological response to dichotic listening in some children with dyslexia, presenting with dyslexia. And again, remember, dyslexia by definition means normal IQ, difficulty learning to read. Okay. So in the study before, how many children with an educational deficit had a dichotic listening issue? And remember, it was over 50%. What about this study? How many dyslexic children had a dichotic listening deficit? In this study, and it's the children above that sort of blue line, 7 out of 10. So 70% of children had with LED in this study means left ear deficit. 3 of the children presenting with dyslexia did not present with a deficit in either ear. Now, what she measured is called a P800. Now that's fancy talk for we expect a response around 800 milliseconds from the presentation or post-presentation in the brain. Now the site CPZ, they label all like where on the scalp this happens. And the CPZ is pretty much, it's in between the ears directly. It's bang in the center at the top of your head. So it's where everything sort of meets, all the planes. It's directly above the corpus callosum, which is what we think is impacted or impaired with children that have poor dichotic listening ability. And in this study, also difficulties learning to read. So they compared the speed at which the response went through the CPZ. So it's called P800 because we expect it to be around 800 milliseconds. So we're looking at the left, the y-axis, target left condition, because there's a left ear deficit. So when the stimuli was given to the left ear, all the solid black squares are the children that could hear dichotic listening normally. All the ones circled, all of those were the 7 that had a left ear deficit. So there's a clear delay. Every single one had a slower response than all the ones that responded normally to the task, including those 3 dyslexic children. So it's obvious by that measure that there's a delay. Now she did a bit more analysis, of course. Oh yeah, there's the P800. So we want those black responses to be around that line. Okay. She analyzed, okay, so let's look at the robustness of the response, not necessarily the speed, but the robustness of the response around 800 milliseconds, and where is the response occurring. The top 2 pictures are the children that had a normal dichotic listening, and the bottom had a left ear deficit. So the one to focus on is the target left. It's clear that it's not near as robust, so it's not as red, and it's not in the center where we want it to be. It's either still going toward the left ear, or more than likely going toward the right hemisphere, but more than likely coming back across the corpus callosum in a weaker and slower time delay. Great. So dichotic listening is if we find it a problem, how in the world do you fix that? Good question. There is evidence that if you have a difficulty, and this is by the same author, Dr. Moncrief, published back in 2008, if you have a dichotic listening deficit and you target that skill with training, can you find an improvement in that skill, and do you find improvements in other areas? So what they did was target that individual, that child with a dichotic listening deficit. They presented information to them through an audiometer, so you can adjust the left and right ear volumes or levels. And the listener had to repeat what was heard through both ears. Now, because they were disadvantaged neurally, they had the left ear presented at a nice, loud, comfortable level, and they had the right ear turned down, however low it needed to be in order for the neural disadvantage to be sort of overcome by an acoustic advantage. And as they responded or reported what they heard in both ears correctly, they would slowly move the right ear louder, and then with unsuccessful responses, move it down again to basically work the system so that they could focus correctly on both ears and make the right ear more and more and more even in presentation level with the left ear. The results were obvious. The right ear, black, pre is on the left, post on the right. Right ear had no advantage, remember, because only the left ear was targeted in the training. But the left ear showed a significant improvement, moving on average almost 20% of an improvement. They did some pre-testing and pre and post language testing with Brigance. They found that even though they didn't target listening comprehension specifically, there was an improvement in the listening comprehension subtest in some of the children that got the dichotic listening therapy from anywhere from 1 year of an improvement up to 4.5 years of an improvement. So here's the pre and post. You'll see I've highlighted in yellow of the children that were targeted in the therapy, the 10, whether they had a bilateral deficit, BLD, or left ear deficit, LED, 6 of the 10 improved either a year or more in the listening comprehension subtest, even though listening comprehension per se wasn't directly targeted. All right, here's another study that investigates dichotic listening and sentence repetition and reading, or in children with reading difficulties. I know I'm spending a lot of time on dichotic listening today, but there's a lot of literature out there, and it seems to be one of the most important skills to test for because it seems to have a very big impact in children's lives. So this study, based out of Hungary, the reason I like it is, again, this is just another example of it's matched for IQ and memory. It also matches for a few different other things that they take into account when they do the analysis. So just to sort of put that point forward. It's a pretty large sample, 180 kids. There was children with reading difficulty, that's the RD, and AMC is the aged matched children. So there was sort of two groups. You can see that the different age groups. So the top groups, the reading difficult children, their results on a dichotic listening task are significantly different to the results of the age matched children. So the right ear, 77 versus 87. So it's about, somewhere between 10 to 15% different in ability to recall the words. Left ear was even more pronounced between the two groups. So the average on the right ear for these three groups was, for the reading disorder group, 73%, right ear, left ear, 53%, the age matched children, 86%, 72%. So 10 to 15% difference on the right ear, and somewhere between 15 to 25% difference, around 20 average percent difference on the left ear. Now, what they did second was have the children repeat sentences. Now, they did a baseline where with both groups, and there was no significant difference at all with both groups being able to say a sentence back, to repeat the sentence, if it wasn't acoustically altered in any way, just normally spoken sentence. Both the children with the reading difficulty and the children that were age matched could repeat the sentences with equal precision. However, when they either added noise, which was 40 dB less speech, so it was a 40 dB signal to noise ratio, or they added, remember we talked about auditory degradation, or making the auditory signal degraded. They compressed those same sentences by 25%, so presented at 25% faster than typical. And then there became a significant difference. So NS is the speech and noise, and TCS is time compressed speech for the different groups. You can see again, reading disordered children, top row, age matched peers on the bottom. If we look at the speech and noise, you can see the ability to repeat the sentence got significantly worse for the reading disordered group. And the same thing for the time compressed speech. And so the average difference for the speech and noise, the children that struggle with reading got dropped by 20%. And when they compress the speech, they drop by 30%. So it's pretty significant. The conclusions of the experiment suggest that there are differences between the children with reading difficulty and their age-matched peers for the dichotic listening test and the acoustically altered sentence repetition tasks. All right, now let's move on to a different type of study that's going to focus, you'll find at the end, a different auditory processing skill other than dichotic listening. This is done out of Australia with Dr. Sharma, and very, very recent, meaning 2018 publication. The aim of their study was to find associations with the auditory processing measures that are predominantly used clinically, meaning the most popular, for lack of a better word, tests that are delivered clinically, and compare that to the ability of children reading words, non-words, and passages, as well as word spelling. So, okay, let's look at the auditory processing measures and which sort of seem to either associate or predict the ability of reading. Now, and spelling. The design was to take 58 individuals between the ages of 7 and 13 with reported listening and or reading concerns. Now, this is probably would be one of the areas that I would find not quite, like self-reporting is not a super robust scientific method, but it's useful. Anyway, so just highlight that. It's a reported listening or reading difficulty. They administered the FPT or frequency pattern test. That's the test where the individual listens for and they need to say high, high, low. A dichotic digits test, so each ear is receiving a digit similar to the example I gave before, where you might have a 6 in one ear and a 2 in the other. Gap detection test, that's that auditory resolution test, how fast, so to speak, can your system hear. And masking level differences, which we didn't cover previously, but that's a brainstem task, testing the superior olive, and it's trying to determine, can we sense phase differences in sound? It's related to the temporal processing, which the gap detection is also sort of touching on. The reading tasks included word, non-word, passage. They also measured phonological processing, core language. Again, remember, nonverbal intelligence, memory, and attention that were also measured. Those variables that some studies say aren't allocated for. Well, yes, they are. Anyway, okay, here we go. Moving on. The results found that when you looked at all of the auditory processing measures, the frequency pattern test, the one that's was the only auditory processing test that accounted for the significant unique variance in both word and non-word reading, so fake words, and also non-word spelling, but it didn't impact or didn't predict ability for passage reading, which is, if you think of the phonological hierarchy, passage reading is clearly going to be higher than word or non-word reading. Their conclusions was that many of the commonly used tests didn't associate with this group of children's reading and spelling outcomes. However, it does support that if you are going to do some auditory processing measures, measuring the pattern of the sound in children with these disorders is important. It predicted 4% of the regular word, a much higher percentage of the non-word, and they account for this, and I agree with their interpretation. They say that when you're listening to the frequency patterns test, it's always something unfamiliar. Like if I go up to somebody and I say, or whistle to them, they're not going to attach any meaning to that. It's a novel stimuli, right? A non-word is always a novel stimuli. So the novel stimuli of the pitch pattern and the novel stimuli of the non-word is going to be processed slightly differently in the brain than the regular word or known words. So you're trying to tell me, Matt, that they found that tonal patterns can predict reading. And in fact, there's been a lot of studies that correlate this pitch pattern test to reading skills. Help me out here. How does patterns of tones relate to reading? Can you sort of draw these link a little bit more to me? Sure. Think of language. Let's drill it right back to its basic form. It is nothing but a pattern. If I take 3 language speech sounds and I present them in one order, k, a, t. Let's take the same sounds, a different order, t, a, k. Different again, act. These are 3 different words. Same sounds. The importance is the order in which they come. So it's not surprising that having somebody listen to the order of sound, the pattern of sound, and focus or attach meaning to it is related to language or reading. Remember we talked about earlier that reading is language? It is just, instead of entering the ear canal, it enters the visual system, but then it goes straight to that auditory pathway. So reading and auditory processing are very much in the same domain. Okay. Now, reading, remember we could predict with the pitch patterns both regular words and non-words, but regular word reading accounts for 23% of a prediction for passage accuracy. So although the pitch patterns didn't associate with the passage, it associated with the words, and then the words associated with the passage, which makes sense with the sort of known hierarchy that we have with learning language and reading. Reading non-words accounted for even a greater percentage accuracy for that passage reading. And remember, non-words, you have to sort of break it down every single time you have it. Okay. Let's see how much time. It's been an hour and a half. I think we're going to have to stop. I wanted to keep going. There's more data that I wanted to sort of review, and it sort of drills down, and it's just more information of how auditory processing predicts higher level skills like phonology, reading, even as young as kindergartner can predict, behavioral measures can predict reading in a 3rd grader. So I'm going to skip through this because it just takes too long. And we won't get to the perceptual cues of speech either. Major take home is not all auditory processing or measures are useful at all stages of development for that study. And here's my references for things that I cited that I didn't have the citation up. And thank you for watching this session 1 of Auditory Processing Advancements. Again, I'm Dr. Matthew Barker, and feel free to take a break, watch session 2 at another time or whenever it is convenient. And always and forever have a wonderful day.